Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with Matthew Iglesias, our contributing editor.
Hello.
Hey, Matt.
What's happening?
So, I've got a bad take today.
Uh-oh.
Yes. You know what it is, so
I do. I got a preview. This is mean. It's mean of you.
It's a mean...
Your claim is that I had a take that was bad.
I know. Unreal.
Which I reject.
Unreal.
All my takes are good.
Yeah, all of them are perfect.
All right, tell the people. What is this about?
Okay, the people. Okay, so we're going back in time for this take. We are in May, and Matt's take in his email newsletter, it's a whole newsletter, but I'm going to just call out a specific chunk. The subhead is titled SBF is for real.
Oh, that's the Sam Bankman-Fried, the pioneering cryptocurrency exchange guy.
I mean, that's one way to describe him.
The youngest billionaire in the world, a very successful businessman. I don't see what the problem could be.
Right. So in your take here, when you're explaining why SBF is for real, you're laying out his goal of getting very rich to do high level good in the world. And, that was at the time back in May, SBF was doing really well. He had started his exchange and people were buying cryptocurrency on it. He's making a lot of money. And then all of a sudden this, the last few weeks, we realized, the whole thing was a house of cards, that he was moving money around and we don't know exactly all the details, but it's in bankruptcy and a lot of money went in and now it's gone. So,
well, yeah, I mean, should we try to explain what happened here in some
in like a factual way, or what do you want to back up to? Actually,
I mean, just in case people haven't heard, right?
Yes.
So this guy, he got very rich. Originally, he was making money with what was called Alameda Research, which was a hedge fund that was doing cryptocurrency trading. And then he started a cryptocurrency exchange called FTX. And FTX was a privately held startup, but it received a very high valuation by venture capital investors that put at least Bankman-Fried's paper net worth at like $22 billion. Then the whole thing collapsed in spectacular fashion, and it turned out that Alameda had lost a ton of money in its hedge fund trades, and that, in effect, Bankman-Fried used the fact that he controlled both of these companies to take FTX customers' deposits and loan them, quote unquote, to Alameda on bad collateral, which then all vanished.
Right.
So, there's a lot of different ways you can put it, but long story short, his investors, these are not FDI insured accounts, and the corporate governance was very bad. So he was able to essentially steal all their money to cover trading losses at his other company. And now the whole thing is kaput.
Right.
And he seems like a bad guy.
I think the key thing to highlight here is that what FTX did is it opened up a way for people to buy cryptocurrencies. They're advertising in the Super Bowl and stuff. So these are just people who are putting their money into this exchange. And it's not like as you were saying, it's not like a bank. It's not insured. So you put some money in a bank, there's collateral there. It's insured. If the bank collapses, theoretically, well, I mean, you would get your money. So that is not what happened here. The reason I think your old take was bad is that what you were doing is...
Because I said he was good, but actually he's bad.
I mean, fundamentally, you were saying he was good.
It's difficult.
But actually, I think he's bad. A lot of the context for this conversation is, it's around FTX itself, were there crimes, what's going on. There's the actual literal saga, which is great and great to follow along. The thing that I want to pinpoint about the badness of your take is the framing around SBF as a guy doing good with his money. And good defined, I would say, in two ways. So you're pointing out that he is giving to pandemic preparedness. And the other thing you're pointing out is gave to liberal candidates. He gives to the Democratic Party. Category one, right, falls under effective altruism, which I want to talk a bit about. Mm-hmm. You're a proponent of effective altruism, and I think we should talk about that. Category two, about him giving politically, he became a kind of hero on the left as sort of the next George Soros. He was the second largest giver to Joe Biden, et cetera. And I want to talk about that as well, because I actually think even at the time he was being celebrated, if you think it is good that he was being celebrated as this figure on the left, and it looked like a truly ideological driven effort, I would say there's some pretty convincing evidence that it was just a run at getting his way in Washington. And I want to talk about that too. So, since it is your bad take, we can break these down in either order that you want to proceed.
This is what I want to talk about, though, actually, is the specific context in which this is happening, right? Because you were characterizing him as a hero on the left. But I think that's wrong. He was a villain on the left. The left hates people who make money through any means. Right.
Okay, but I'm talking about him as a hero of the political left in terms of the people who are invested in getting Democrats elected to Congress.
He was a hero to partisan Democrats, yes. Right? But the controversy that I was weighing in on was left-wing Democrats were saying this guy is bad. That this whole pandemic prevention thing he's doing, this guarding against pandemics nonprofit that he's running, this Protect Our Future PAC, that this is all fake.
Okay.
Right? That was the left's claim about Sam Bankman-Fried. And I was saying in that piece that I don't believe that is true, that I think that this is a real organization, that there is a genuine desire to get the United States of America to invest more money in biosecurity, and that is what this is about, that it's not a front for cryptocurrency lobbying. Part of how I would make that case is that there was all this cryptocurrency lobbying. Like FTX, as you would expect for a company in Washington, D.C., had lobbyists on its payroll, FTX lobbyists. And Bankman-Fried gave a lot of money to Democrats. He had a business partner, Ryan Salame, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, who was a Republican. He gave a lot of money to Republicans. They were in a lobbying coalition along with other cryptocurrency companies, lobbying for a specific piece of legislation.
Okay, two things. One, he was not part of a wide coalition of cryptocurrency, right? He was actually pissing off a number of other companies that were not aligned with him.
Well, then there's the other crypto. Yes, but I'm just saying.
So I don't think I don't think you should represent this as a coalition of an industry coalition pushing for something. It was certainly FTX's push, and that the work that they were doing was dominated by SBF, that he was the face of it and the behind the scenes person, that he was really somebody who was responsible for getting the version of the bill he wanted.
This is what I'm trying to say. If you want to know what was Sam Bankman-Fried doing on cryptocurrency lobbying, you just look. He was doing a ton of stuff on cryptocurrency lobbying.
Right.
Right? Like with his cryptocurrency lobbyists, with his testimony before Congress on the subject of cryptocurrency regulation, he hired Mark Wetjen, who was one of the Obama-era CFTC commissioners, to be like their lead guy on drafting legislation that was to create a CFTC regulatory framework. They were allied with some crypto companies in this push for this legislation. There were other crypto companies that were against them. There's a vast domain of cryptocurrency lobbying. The claim that was being made by leftists at the time was that the pandemic prevention work was fake. Right? And that this was all just a charade to do cryptocurrency lobbying. I did not believe that at that time. I am certainly open to revising my opinion about that, because when you find out that a guy is like a huge liar and a fraud, it raises questions. But there has now been a lot of reporting on FTX and the FTX fallout. And as far as I can tell, none of it cuts against that.
Okay. What I would say cuts against it is this. You're saying he was pushing a bunch of liberal stuff to make a lot of money to invest in a real push, a real effort on pandemic reform.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to dispute that there are organizations that are doing actual effective altruism and want to, they want to help the world. You can weigh the merits of each of these individual efforts. Setting that aside, I think that is true. I think that is real. But this idea that his heart was in the right place. Like, oh, he's good because he's trying to make money to do that. See, I'm right. I think that personally, I don't think you can look at his behavior in that time period and say like, oh yeah, he's definitely just trying to, get some liberals elected and do this thing over here. Like, you can't separate out his lobbying activities. His business partner, he had an interest in maintaining his company, and the way he was going to do it was by pushing for weak regulations. We know he's not a big regulations guy. He recently said, fuck regulators. He was trying to set up his business so that he was unaccountable, so that he could do whatever he wanted. And he was running a company at the expense of other people. That he was taking other people's money, throwing it around, moving it around in at the very least shady ways. And, he's claiming he's doing it for the greater good. But he's a smart guy.
I'm in a difficult position here because, obviously, I went to bat for the guy. The guy turns out to be a fraud.
Yes.
That's bad. He is bad. It's a bad look for me.
Yeah.
I totally get that. I grant that. That being said, right, like, you put me on the hot seat, right? The bad take wasn't like the Forbes magazine cover that said he's the next Warren Buffett. Right? The bad take, there's a lot of bad takes about Sam Bankman-Fried out there. The one you put on was like specifically the one that I wrote, which obviously, if I could go back in time to May of 2022, the Sam Bankman-Fried piece I would have written was blowing the whistle on the fact that FTX was a fraud, right? But I was trying to address a question about the legitimacy of the grant making and political contributions related to pandemic prevention. And, I went a couple of days after this whole thing collapsed.
Yeah.
I went to a conference that was called Operation Warp Speed 2.0. And it was co-sponsored by Federation of American Scientists and an organization called One Day Sooner. And, they had panels there where they had the guys who did Operation Warp Speed in the Trump administration, sort of talking about how did that come together, how did that vaccine development come together. They had panels about, what can we do to accelerate development of nasal vaccines and, next generation kind of COVID vaccine work. They had a panel that I moderated that was about, can we use this same kind of funding and regulatory model to do work on carbon removal and electrical grid sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. Tons of the people at this really boring, earnest conference about biomedical funding models had some piece of Sam Bankman-Fried grants over the course of the past year, and I don't want to put people on the spot now by saying stuff that might look bad for them, but it's just the case that whether or not this was a bad guy, I mean, I shouldn't say whether or not, because he was a bad guy. He gave a lot of money to people who spent the past year doing a lot of very earnest work on America's ability to detect novel viruses, our ability to develop vaccines, our ability to develop sort of passive technologies for destroying vaccines. Not even the concept of quote unquote effective altruism, but the specific stuff that was getting grants. I think a lot of it was good. And it is certainly possible that some of it was some kind of scam. There's a million reporters covering the Sam Bankman-Fried fallout. But so far, that's not what they've turned up, And I think it's really unfortunate for the world if the takeaway from this is that, people trying to get us more interested in lab security, virus detection, vaccine development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are all bad people. Whereas if our takeaway from this is something about cryptocurrency regulation, I say 2 thumbs up, but it still seems unclear to everyone actually how we should regulate cryptocurrencies.
Okay, 2 things. One, the question of whether or not I'm responding directly to your take. Your take was not, dear the left who say SBF is just a charade and he's not real, he's giving to this thing that's not even real. You could have written a piece that said, pandemic preparedness is real, it's important, and here's why, and here's all the work that's being done, and I want to defend it. And I think that the best way to understand what's going on with this is to set aside one person and understand, the work that's being done, because this is why it matters. You could have done that. You could have said in defense of SBF's, what he's backing, because you're saying the criticism was that that stuff wasn't real. But your piece doesn't do that. Your piece is making the case that SBF's somehow his heart was in the right place. You kind of had this bulleted list of proof that he cares about this issue.
Well, it's not what, right? I mean, I'm just like, I want to clarify the timeline, right? I'm saying in May.
I just want to tell you that, you can't, go back in time and say what this piece was doing was responding to the idea that the underlying efforts he was supporting were not real. Is not really the point of your take. The point of your take is you're trying to stand by a guy who's giving to those things and showing that he's doing it in a way that's good. And unless I'm misreading it, is there some section in here I'm not seeing that's making the case that the thing underneath it is good? Because I'm reading it as you are defending this person. And frankly, it is good that somebody gives money to a thing. But, you went out on a limb for the guy and, you didn't include in your article that as much money as he's given, to your kind of hero candidate in the lead, his partner was giving to Republican candidates on the other side. And the reason for that is they wanted to be able to keep running their business as they were. And so, sure, you could look at it as one lens of okay, he's giving to these liberal candidates, but you can't leave out of your take, hey, also the other side, his buddy is giving an equal amount to Republican candidates.
Well, but again, I don't.
And that's fine. Look, you can say.
No, but listen. I just again, obviously, this is not the piece that I would write in November 2022, right? But there was a controversy raging in the spring of 2022, and the controversy wasn't, should you invest in cryptocurrency? Right? And my piece does not say you should invest in cryptocurrency. It doesn't say FTX is an amazing company. It doesn't say a great thing to do in general is put your money in non-FDIC insured investment vehicles, right? It's responding to a question about, is pandemic prevention operation that Sam Bankman-Fried is funding, is this a front for lobbying about cryptocurrency? I said that it wasn't. I do not have the level of confidence that I used to have in that, but I still don't think it has actually factually been debunked by the past couple weeks worth of reporting.
All right.
I wait to see. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Again, just today, I read something about there was a vacation house in the Bahamas that was paid for with FTX funds that was used as a getaway for Bankman-Fried's parents. So we didn't know that 24 hours ago. We do know it today. That's why reporters report out the stories.
Right.
Once a guy steals billions of dollars in customer deposits,
yeah,
you feel like an idiot for having, vouched for him, right? And if it comes out tomorrow that actually 25% of gap funding was stolen, or 30% of the lobbying time that was supposedly being done on pandemics was really about CFTC regulations, I would not be surprised at this point to learn anything about this operation, right? It is a fraud of mind-boggling dimensions. That being said, we are now more than a week into the story, and I don't think that anything that has come out in a specific way undermines the work that was being done on the pandemic side, which I say not as a defense of myself, because I still went out on a limb for a person who turns out to be a bad guy, but I do say on behalf of the people who got the money, who are doing work that I think is good. I think a really bad thing for the world would be to create a situation in which there's now negative brand halo on pandemic prevention, because this strikes me as still a underinvested topic that we need to sort of do something about.
So can I say, I think your explanation of your previous bad take makes a lot of sense to me. I think what I want to get at now, I think what you're saying, just let me, if this is right. What is so frustrating to you is at the end of the day, SBF, there's a lot of people out there who do terrible things and, they get caught up and the Justice Department and the SEC steps in. He is a bad guy, as it turns out. But what you don't want to have happen is for the story about, hey, over here, we need to really talk about crypto regulation means that over there, we really shouldn't do we shouldn't invest in pandemic preparedness. And that seems like something that's Matt Zeitlin and Maggie Severns at Grid kind of explored this of like, to what extent is Sam Bankman-Fried, his fiasco splashing onto effective altruism in an unfair or fair way, right? Like that's what feels unfair here is like, yes, there is a bad actor here, but that doesn't take anything away from people who are really trying to do some good in the world and prepare for the next pandemic.
After the full extent of pharmaceutical companies' complicity in launching the opioid epidemic became clear to people, there started to be a lot of scrutiny about all the art museums that the Sackler family sort of funded with their money, right? And people, criticized the sort of reputation laundering that happens in the art world and questioned whether all these different galleries and stuff should still have the Sackler name on them now that we sort of know how that money was assembled. And those seem like good questions and somewhat difficult questions. What I don't think anybody asked in the wake of those opioid revelations was like, does this discredit art? Right? Does it turn out that people who think museums are good were in fact wrong all along because art museums are just a front for opioid manufacturing? Right? And that's because art and art museums are so old and such an old and familiar idea that we think absolutely there is a question to be asked about what do we do when it turns out that major donors and like people things are named after were actually scumbags. And of course, this is a question we ask about universities all the time, right? You look at the old buildings at America's oldest colleges and universities and how was that money made? And often it's like not that pretty. And we talk about what we should think about that. But again, nobody says, oh, okay, if like some of the founders of Yale were like mixed up in the slave trade, that means we shouldn't have colleges, right? And because effective altruism is a much newer movement than that, a much less familiar idea, and an idea that was introduced to a lot of people, frankly, just like earlier this fall by profiles of Will McCaskill, it is under much more sort of root and branch scrutiny, which is fine. I mean, like journalistic, like I've read Matt's piece in Grid, and I think that's a good article, but I question to an extent the logic of that kind of application.
Well, I think the logic, right, is what you're getting at. People know what an art museum is, its mission, what it is, what it does. And then you've got this thing that's called effective altruism, which sounds, I remember the first time I heard about this, we were both at Vox and we were talking about kind of covering it as a beat, and we're sitting there and I was sitting there kind of skeptical because it was like, okay, you're challenging how I think about doing good in the world. Mm-hmm. It felt a little bit like, well, who is to say this? Like, these are very sweeping in a way. I think one thing maybe we should do is give a sort of sense of what effective altruism is in case people, are getting up to speed.
Well, let's just give, what's your thesis?
Yeah, I'll give you my thought on it. So my first understanding of effective altruism, I had to warm up to it because it was just a different, to be honest, maybe it's just it's a terrible thing, but it just seemed like a bunch of nerds who were like, I have the answer to everything and we're going to make the world better and everybody else has screwed it up. And that was my first impression. And that was wrong as I understand it now. So I was just wrong, but it really rubbed me the wrong way. Like they need a PR something because I was just really turned off by the way it was presented. And really what all effective altruism is saying is like, let's be effective. Let's give money in a way that's going to help the most number of people and look for measurable results. So let's use data that we have. Let's use science that we have. Let's measure what's going on, and we can see, if we give, if we invest in mosquito nets, that does a lot for people. Malaria medication, that does a lot. Clean water, etc. That these are things that do a ton of good with not that much money. So if we put in a lot of money, it creates a lot of good. And I've been won over by that, and especially looking at all of the different types of things that effective altruism is interested in. And it's not just one or two things. I mean, I also, animal welfare was one that kind of came up, and which is another issue that, when I first kind of thought about it, kind of challenged my thinking. And over time, I've thought, my thinking has changed. And so to me, it is understandable that if you're looking at this and it's like, wait, what is cryptocurrency? It sounds weird. It's called effective altruism. Sounds weird. And the guy who's giving all the money to it is weird and possibly a scammer. So I think it is important to think about how to suss these things out. And so anyway, that is my thinking, and that is my generous take on why the general public might conflate these things or meld them together. And in terms of then being like, I don't know if we want this effective altruism thing, of course, like, it is different than Yale. Like, right? I learned about effective altruism 5 years ago and was a little bit like, a little skeptical. Yale I've known about for quite a while. So, you've identified that. But, and maybe you're talking about the piece and grid, which you seem a little cool too. And that's something to think about in the media, is like, when a scandal is unfolding and you're throwing around terms and you're covering things incrementally, it's like, well, what are we really saying? What is this story about? What are we really saying about crypto, about one bad actor, about a movement, about one organization potentially in a movement, which that can happen. You can have a movement that's doing a lot of good, and then there's somebody, it's the organization itself is corrupt. So anyway,
let's take a break.
Okay.
And I want to sort of talk about effective altruism over time. Okay, so my introduction to effective altruism came, I would say, probably earlier than yours. And what happened was I had written some articles about an organization called Give Directly. And Give Directly is a group that it still exists. And what they do is they try to do direct cash transfers initially to people. I believe it was in Kenya, but it was an East African country that had a lot of sort of cell phone based banking. So it was actually possible to do electronic deposits to some of the poorest people on earth. And this struck me as like a really cool idea, right? It's like, what if we helped people in need by just giving them money? And they had some like RCTs, randomized controlled trials, showing the impact of this kind of thing. And they were trying to get more money. And so I wrote some supportive things about this. Not like big philosophical things, but just like, hey, like, I gave these guys, $100 or whatever. Like, you should check it out. Then some months later, I was at my college reunion. And this guy, Holden Karnofsky, who had been in my class, and I like knew very slightly, but was not like a friend of mine. He comes up to me, at the bar at some event, and he's like, Matt, I saw you wrote about Give Directly. I need to tell you about GiveWell, which is my new group. And GiveWell was a thing that Holden and this other guy who had both been working, I think, in hedge funds or maybe consulting, some, kind of like bad sounding job. And they had both been thinking, like, we're good people. We want to give a lot of money to charity, but we want to give the money to charity that's like actually effective. And so let's like use our consulting brains to try to figure out like where should we actually give the money to, right? And so they did research, and it's up there that this organization still exists. I give them money all the time. And they are trying to ask the question, who should you give money to if you aren't just doing PR, right? So like Amazon gives a lot of money to homelessness causes in the Seattle area, which I think is commendable. That's like a good cause. But the specific reason that Amazon gives money to homelessness in the Seattle area is that Amazon's main base of operations is in Seattle. And there's a perception that a downside to all the good paying jobs that Amazon has created is that it exacerbates homelessness. So they're doing something good by supporting these homelessness causes, but the reason they're doing it is PR for Amazon, right? So what Holden was trying to ask is, what if I wasn't trying to do PR? Right? What if I'm not just trying to get critics of the consulting industry off my back? What if I actually want to answer the question, what is the most cost-effective thing I can do with the money? And that's GiveWell. And I think their answer for a long time has been stuff related to malaria, right? Then there's a philosophical argument that not just like this is an interesting exercise, but that this is actually the thing that you should do. Right. And Will MacAskill is a Scottish philosopher. He starts separately, but in a very aligned way, doing talks and writing a book called Doing Good Better, which is saying, look, if you want to do good in the world, well, you should want to do good in the world. Right. Like
I'm nodding. Listeners at home, I'm nodding.
The altruism part is important. Right. You shouldn't just be selfish. And then B, look, most idealistic young people who want to have a positive impact on the world think about something like, well, I should go work for Greenpeace because Greenpeace is trying to stop climate change and climate change is a big problem. And MacAskill's contention was, no, that's the wrong way to think about this, that it's actually surprisingly hard to get a low-paying nonprofit job. Like, these positions are actually quite competitive because a lot of people want to work for Sierra Club, things like that. And that really what we ought to do is just encourage people to give more money to highly cost-effective charities. That is the way to be effective about your altruism instead of just kind of going down high-minded sort of career lanes. So that's what I would call like old-fashioned effective altruism. What happened over time, though, is that as more people got interested in this idea, there became a larger and larger community of people who would talk about questions like, well, is preventing malaria cases really the most, important thing in the world? And some people started to say, no, we should talk about animal suffering. Right. So that's another important EA cause area that you mentioned. And that started with people asking about the welfare of farm animals. Right. And so cows and chickens and pigs are treated very poorly on farms. And so there's a cause area around that. Something on the cutting edge is, well, wild animals suffer too. And animals that aren't very charismatic suffer. Like the conditions of farmed shrimp seem really bleak. And so you start to get out into like weird stuff. Where if you tell someone I'm giving money to poor people in Africa or I'm giving money to help kids so they don't die from malaria, I think most people will be like, okay, that makes sense to me. If you tell people I want to improve the well-being of farmed shrimp, they're going to be like, are you an insane person?
Yeah. I mean, look, shrimp, there's very few neurons there and stuff.
I don't know. I have not looked into the shrimp thing.
Anyway, but the point is, yes, it is more,
weird.
It definitely, I think that there is a historical culture of, hey, I'm going to help poor children somewhere in the world. Great. It's very easy to understand, and there's a long tradition of that. There is not a long tradition of caring about the well-being of shrimp.
But the tradition, the culture, which you nailed, is that it is a group of weird nerds, right? Whose like thing is being contentious. Right. And trying to say, no, actually working for a hedge fund and giving 15% of your income to this malaria charity, that makes you a better person than going to work like in political advocacy. Right. Or the well-being of farmed shrimp is actually a more important cause than climate change. And, that by design, I think like rubs people the wrong way. Like you're trying to challenge people's ideas about what's really important in the world. And most recently, and this is MacAskill's newest book, and it's also the thing Sam Bankman-Fried put his money into, because Bankman-Fried did not put money into global public health, as far as I know. I've been asking people, and they keep saying no, he wasn't supporting this. Bankman-Fried got really interested in what's called long-termism, which is basically the idea. There's a lot to long-termism.
I think long-termism is starting to get into. So let's just pause on this trajectory, right? I think that the direct giving, I mean, microfinancing was big, and all of this as well, I guess, is similar to direct giving. And you've seen this transfer, you see where this has headed. And as the movement grows, you've got kind of intellectuals who are challenging themselves and thinking things through and having these debates. And these are not the types of debates, I think, that, if you are, say, an American who attends a church and is part of your, your religious obligations and your faith and view of the world, that you give 10% of your salary every year away, that you pick a charity and you support it, that it is sort of a moral calling and it's seen through that lens. And if you then hear about, once you start saying, okay, step one, there's this Scottish philosopher, that's a very different view of charity, that it's about heart and not logic. And so that is where I think we start to get into the current day, is that the broader exposure to EA is around this group of people who are quite eccentric, that they have eccentric lifestyles and everything. And it's just a different frame, right? It's like, wow, these people are not like me. They do not see giving the same way that I do. They don't live the way I do. It's just a very foreign concept for a lot of people. And that's kind of where we are. But I think now we get into, I think long-termism is a piece of that as well. So now you're getting into something that I think is important as it relates specifically to FTX and risk.
Well, and also, but also something very specific, right? Because EA, there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of different cause areas involved. I've mentioned a lot of cause areas involved. There was this incredible media push around long-termism, but really just like one guy, Will MacAskill, and his book, What We Owe the Future.
Right.
There was a New Yorker profile of him. It was reviewed everywhere. He had the best funded and most effective book rollout that I've ever seen. And to the best of my knowledge, that was almost all paid for by Sam Bankman-Fried.
So I didn't know that.
What most people, breaking news here, I got scoops.
Hey, there you go, a scoop.
So what most people will have heard about this, people who did not work at Vox or did not read a Slate article in 2013, is really one specific philosopher's work, which was being amplified by one specific rich guy, right?
Yes.
And so I want on this pod to both correct the misimpression that Sam Bankman-Fried and Will MacAskill are all there is to effective altruism, but also acknowledge that the super duper prominent spurt of effective altruism visibility was really just driven by Sam Bankman-Fried and his rise to wealth and power and his money. And this is where I think the good questions really are, right? Which is, you can ask someone, what is Christianity, right? And you can start rattling off propositions, right? Christianity is about Jesus Christ and how he died for mankind's sins, and it has these different values, and I'm explaining Christianity. Or you can say, look, what is this church, right? And the church is an institution. The church has a minister or a priest. The church is either affiliated with a broader network of churches or it isn't. It might have a board of trustees or it might not, right? It's a human institution. And churches and synagogues, as I was in the beginning, have flaws or virtues that are not that tightly related to the abstract ideas that they kind of claim to instantiate, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's the big question here is why did this, not the large number of people who may have given some money to GiveWell or attended an EA conference sometime, but the small number of people who control the Center for Effective Altruism in the UK really went all in on Sam Bankman-Fried they didn't just take his money and use it to do things. Everybody takes people's money. But like they have this podcast, 80,000 Hours, which is one of the CEA's big projects. And they interview lots of people. I've been on that show. It's a pretty good show. But they had an episode with Bankman-Fried in which, the point of that is that like this is a really, this is a guy who you should listen to. And he's on that show. He's actually explaining quite overtly like his idea that the smart thing for him to do is take these like crazy reckless risks all the time. It's something he was quite open about. He and I met one time. He explained this to me. I kind of thought he was like putting me on, that this was just like talk at a bar because it made so little sense. And I only found out later that it was something he just like said in lots and lots of interviews and was not giving me secret information about. And it's really, I think, strange. And I think it shows poor judgment on the part of other people that you would listen to that and say, okay, like I want to be in business with this guy.
Right. There were some nominations in this episode, the Sam Bankman-Fried episode of 80,000 Hours with some of his points. And if you go back, you can find the episode. We'll link to it. And it's, you can read through, it's just wild what he's saying, and what choices he would make. And on the one hand, I am sympathetic. Like, you do want to go big. You want to do the most good effectively as you can, and it's better to take a big swing. Okay, I get it. But the problem was, he's doing it with other people's money.
Well,
is his approach to the world. And this is the link, right? That the leap between his approach. He has a school of thought that applies to effective altruism and how he thinks effective altruism should pick projects and spend money. And then clearly the same view of his business was take huge risks because it's better to make a lot of money. And it feeds then back into effective altruism. He wants to make a lot of money so he can feed it back. But it's his views on risk are just wild.
Well, and it also, there's a double game at work here, right? Matt Levine, who's a great financial journalist, Sam Bankman-Fried told me that Matt Levine is the best financial journalist.
Don't say that. Poor Matt Levine. Matt, we have no idea. We independently, many people think he is an excellent journalist.
But so Matt did an interview with Bankman-Fried that's become sort of infamous, in which he's like asking Bankman-Fried, explain how yield farming works with cryptocurrency. And Bankman-Fried describes a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
And Levine asks him, like, so are you saying this is all Ponzi schemes? And Bankman-Fried says, no, I'm not saying it's all Ponzi schemes, but like, yes, basically, the cryptocurrency is being used for a lot of Ponzi schemes. And, Matt wrote in one of his newsletters after that, he said, I thought that reflected well on Bankman-Fried, right? That this was an exchange and it was being run by someone who was relatively clear-eyed about it and someone who was not like a Bitcoin fanatic. And my conversation with SBF, we didn't get that deep into crypto, but he didn't make a hard sell about it, which is unusual. Like I've talked to a bunch of crypto lobbyists and stuff and tech people, investors, and they'll try to talk me into it. And Bankman-Fried was like, there just wasn't really a good platform for trading crypto. And so I thought that I would make one.
Yeah.
And you could make money in it. And then he said he wanted it down the road. He invested a lot of money. He bought a chunk of Robinhood. And the stated plan, at least to sophisticated people like me and Matt Levine, was to try to transcend cryptocurrency. The thing that should have given everyone, but certainly me, more pause is that while he was telling me this and he was saying this stuff to Matt Levine and Odd Lots, which is a really good podcast, but kind of a brainiac podcast, he also had these huge billboards that was him and Tom Brady and Giselle being I'm in on crypto, right? And so he was telling a fairly elite audience, like, don't worry, I'm not an idiot. I understand that this is kind of a scam. And then he was telling a mass audience, like, come, get in on the scam.
Yeah. Give me your money.
That's not good, right? Like, something that I think we should really appreciate about a company like Apple, say, is that whatever bad things they may do, the basic proposition is like they sell you phones in exchange for money. And you can go as far you want into the like super detailed technology press, the business press. And like the message is always, we're selling phones for a lot more money than it costs us to make them. And that's how we're going to make a lot of money. Whereas FTX was really always different stories to different audiences, which means someone is getting scammed.
I don't know. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, two things. One, I think if crypto wasn't the hot thing right now, but if there was something else, I don't know, something else that had emerged in recent years, and it was difficult for the sort of masses to participate in it, I think SBF would have made some other kind of exchange. To your point that it's, he wanted an exchange. It's for crypto, but anyway, he saw an opening of, hey, we could create a way for more people to invest in this. And he knew at the same time that it was kind of nonsense, that crypto was not a great investment, but he didn't care. He's like, I'm just going to, sucker people into this. I think maybe we all should have seen that a little bit more as this was unfolding, like to your sort of piece where narrowly, yes, I understand your point that you were responding to the left on this issue of, is he doing this? He's giving money to this thing and that is good. But it wasn't really about, let's step back and look at the holistic, let's take a real look at what he's up to. And, maybe that's not on you in one piece or something, but it is sort of like, man, in hindsight, you see it with all types of things that collapse. You see it with Enron and other things. And that's just something that I want to think about. It was just sort of challenging assumptions about people and what they're up to. And there is just this certain irony.
I also think that the basic issue here was not clarified to the media audience in an adequate way, right? Which is, there's a complicated aspect of what went wrong at FTX and a complicated aspect of cryptocurrency, but there's a sort of a very simple issue here, which is that these were companies. Your bank has two sides to it, right? One is that your deposits are insured by the FDIC. The other is that because it's insured, they are very tightly regulated, right? And those two sides go together really, really well. I used to be a depositor at a bank called Riggs Bank that was here in D.C. It was a very old Washington, D.C. banking family, very distinguished, all the trappings of trustworthiness. It turned out after 9/11 that they were laundering money for Islamist terrorists.
Who among us?
Once that came out, it turned out that they had been laundering money for like various other people for a period of years, right? So fraud, like bad things can happen in very traditional finance. But what happened here was they were fined into oblivion by the Justice Department, which meant that the accounts at the bank, because I was a depositor, I did not rush to pull my money out.
Right, because
it was insured. FDIC insured.
Yeah.
So they closed the bank one Friday. It is handed off over the weekend to PNC Bank out of Pittsburgh. On Monday, they reopen it. The assets are now PNC assets. It took like a year to get all the signs changed and stuff like that. But from the depositor standpoint, there was no problem.
Right.
From the bank standpoint, you can get away with breaking the rules, like as Riggs was for several years, but you're not supposed to break the rules. They have these regulators. If they catch you, you get in trouble, and it limits the amount of money that you can make. It has always, always, always been possible to run a more profitable bank by not following the rules.
Sure.
And to essentially get away with not following the rules by being outside of the regulatory umbrella. By, for example,
being in the
your
Bahamas.
bank in the Bahamas, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just like my piece, but like every article about FTX should have said up near the top.
Yeah, it's based in the Bahamas.
Not just it's based in the Bahamas, but the reason that this is lucrative is that it's not regulated. And the downside to putting your money in an unregulated banking operation is you might just lose it all.
Yes.
Right? Like, that should have been the second paragraph of any article that was about this. I don't think you can blame anyone for not having detected the specifics of the fraud here. But the fact is, like, the basic question, why is this in the Bahamas? It's in the Bahamas so that it won't be regulated by American bank regulators. What is the upside to that? They are allowed to take risks that wouldn't be allowed in the United States. What's the downside to that? You might lose all your money with no recourse. And like, I knew that. Like, that's why my money was not in FTX. Yeah. But like, my article didn't like say that in big bold letters at the top, and nor did most of the coverage of this. Even like moderately crypto skeptical coverage would be like getting into the technology, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like, your shady offshore bank could be investing in anything, and you have the same basic problem. Like, if you've made it this far in the podcast, like, just like, don't put your money in weird offshore investment vehicles unless
you're prepared to lose it all. You know, I mean, I guess.
Well, or you have like a super fancy Swiss lawyer,
I guess,
who's like telling you this is a good kind of shady bank. Like,
no, I mean, look. I mean, we all know. Well, maybe not we. You and I know about my my time with the Robinhood app and how much I enjoy it. Well, I've been cutting back on my time in the last year or two with that. But I was never, let me just say, put out there, I was like, oh, this cryptocurrency, no. Like, this is bad. Like, the guys in the Bahamas, like, this is terrible. I didn't think to write that into anything I was working on, but I also wasn't really covering this. I do think, going back to the weirdness of this crowd, there was almost, to me, this sense of they know something we don't. Like he's so smart. Like, he's so strange. Like, clearly he's a genius and there's something going on. But really what was going on is like, no, that's not. He was running a terrible operation. And I don't know. We've seen that time and again in the world where we're overtaken by a single person or a character and gloss over the details. One thing I actually do think is kind of important and sort of, I don't know if it's funny at all, but like, even if you're in the Bahamas, it turns out you can't just move. Well, I don't know if both entities were in the Bahamas, but Alameda is in the United States. And so when you're moving money from FTX over to your other company, that's a problem. And so that's part of what is going on here, is that his American company is regulated, and that's, a big piece of this, and that's why.
Well, also, I mean, the Bahamas, we should be clear, is not.
It's not a total Wild West.
It's not a land of anarchy. They have laws there too.
I assume they also have laws in Bahamas where you're not allowed to cover your losses in one company by dragging over deposits from another one. I suspect that they do have some regulators, and that's interesting. Is like, okay, yes. The problem with this was that they way overvalued the entire exchange based on, like, they're like, this coin is worth a lot. And it's like, well, is it? No, it's not. So anyway, so it's all based on this collateral that doesn't really exist, or underlying value. But like, really, at the end of the day, it's just a classic, like, you kind of were screwed and tried to shadily move money from one entity to another. It's not even per se well, maybe we'll see.
Right,
we don't know that for sure, but I think there is something about it where this is revealing a big problem with crypto, right? That people are investing in it, they don't realize the risk potentially, or ignore the risk, or whatever. At the same time, it's never been okay to try to, air quote, loan yourself money from one company to another. So there's like, I think, a double thing here of like kind of crypto problems, but also just that has never been okay to do that.
I mean, right. It's never been okay. I think the question is like, to what extent has it been legal or known? I mean, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm definitely not a Bahamian securities lawyer. Something that people who are attorneys tell me is that usually when you have large-scale financial transactions, regardless of where your company is located, the settlements tend to clear in New York. That's just like the way the global banking system works. So it's usually possible, if something that meets a like common sense, ordinary language sense of like fraud, to generate some kind of US legal case against the person. So, you know, the offshore nature of the enterprise may turn out to be less relevant than you might have thought. That being said, what was knowable from the beginning, right? When you have a company that is run by an American, but it is headquartered in the Bahamas, right? Like, the reason for that is that he wants to be out of the US regulatory umbrella. And I feel bad for people who lost their money as a result of this, but on a forward-looking basis, just like the next time someone sets up a financial institution deliberately outside of the US regulatory umbrella, ask yourself whether that really sounds like a good idea to you.
Yes, I think that is a fundamental point here.
Right? Like, because I think American bank regulation is like actually pretty great. And a lot of people got very disillusioned with American bank regulation after the 2008 financial crisis, which was without question like the biggest failure of the regulatory system in over 100 years. It is still the case that everybody's bank deposits were completely safe throughout all of that.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
like your stock market investments lost money to the extent that the stock prices went down, but like nobody stole your money.
Nobody. Yes, you could still, your checking account was there, and you know there was no. Yes,
it's a pretty good system,
stable
actually, and you know, just like it sounds good, I guess. While people are on the top, to be like, well, we don't need these sloppy regulations and so on and so forth, but like the reason for those regulations is to make it affordable to provide all that insurance, right?
Yes.
Because you might think, well, it's great that these bank accounts are insured, but the cost of that must be exorbitant. But the cost is actually very low because the institutions are regulated.
Regulated because the risk is very low of a bank collapsing. I do want to just side note here on regulations. I mean, there are some regulations in the Bahamas. Like I don't know if you saw, the FT got a copy of that. It was like the copy of their deposits and their spending. I think it was like it was some kind of document showing, you know, what their books were, like what their money was looking like. And it had this thing of like, could have typos, or definitely has typos, of course. And also, you know, it was like, maybe we invested in this. And like it looks like they had to Google around to find out what they had invested in. Like they didn't even know, like they weren't even tracking that. And at a bank in America, you just can't do that. You just, you know, you'd be in trouble if you're just sort of Googling around to see what it was that you invested in and see if somebody else wrote it down. It's bad.
I mean, it's also worth saying, like the Bahamas, you know, is an independent nation state, but it's tiny. There's 400,000 people in the Bahamas. So, you know, they just don't have like a gigantic regulatory apparatus. And I think that probably in the long arc of world history, it is never going to make sense for a major, giant global financial enterprise to be headquartered there.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we should wrap with some points.
Yeah.
My points are SBF is bad.
You're a bad guy.
Maybe it wasn't as knowable as we know now in May. However, there were some signs that things were amiss, and maybe that could have been included in your take. 2, effective altruism as a way of thinking about giving, I think could be a lot more appealing to a lot of people if it were if people were understanding it in a more accessible way that makes sense to most people, and that the person delivering that is really important. You know, it matters who is saying, you know, give your money to X, and unfortunately, you know, fair or unfair, SBF it was, the biggest donor to this cause. And yes, like it feels maybe it is unfair, but that is what's going to happen. And so if these groups want to stay afloat, like they can't just say like we're like an art museum. That's just, just reality. And I think it is valuable to think about that. That there are valuable, there are people doing valuable work out there, but they're just, unless they accept that SBF screwed them over, they're not gonna this is just unfortunate for them, And my last thought connected to that is just like, I don't know, man. The effective altruism community is just not relatable, and they should really push forward some people who may it is not as small as I think it comes across to people on the internet. If you go back and look at Vox's 50, they did a sort of 50 top effective altruists, or I forget their framing on it, but it's just, you see the variety of types of people who are doing this kind of work, and they should probably think about that, putting some of those people forward. Those are my takes.
Yeah, well, that's what they're trying to do there. So look, Sam Bankman-Fried, bad guy. I guess I wish I had said that more clearly. Because I actually, I don't think that any of the specifics of this fraud really were knowable. But I think that a lot of people in EA have been in denial about the fact that the whole thing had an air of this, what we were talking about at the end. It's like, what was the purpose of any of this, right? If not to run, at a minimum, excessively risky financial schemes financed by people who didn't understand the risks that they were getting into. And I think a lot of people knew that that's what was going on, myself included, but it is more fun to focus on the positive. And then things blow up, right? I mean, there's going to be incredible reputational blowback, as well as people losing their money, which is, it's quite bad.
Yeah. It is bad. I mean, look, in some of these groups, it's going to turn out that they kind of knew, or there will be the emails in the bankruptcy court coming out that groups that do good work were like, yeah, this is a Ponzi scheme, but let's just take the money or whatever, so that's not going to be great, but we'll stay tuned.
All right, this has been another episode of Bad Takes from Grid. Our producer is Olivia Reingold. We would appreciate it if you would give us good reviews, lots of stars, tell your friends, tell the world, and we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.